What's up, Devoted? Tim G here. Happy 2023. Hope everyone's new year is off to a solid start. Now, if you're like me and very goal oriented, there's a lot you want to achieve this year, a lot of self improvements you want to make, really feeling ambitious or excited about everything we can achieve in this next 12 months or so. However, as I was reflecting on everything I personally want to accomplish in this next calendar year, one thought that came to mind that I figured I'd unpack and talk a little bit about in this Devo is the need to depend on God's strength as opposed to our own. As one narrative in Scripture that I think highlights this point quite nicely is the back half of Genesis 32, in which Jacob wrestles with God. So I figured we'd unpack this text a little bit. So now, for contextual purposes, in the first half of Genesis 32, Jacob is preparing to meet again with Esau, who he hasn't seen in quite a while. And out of fear that Esau will attack him, he takes three precautionary steps. First, he assembles his men into two different groups. Second, he prays to God and appeals on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant for protection. And third, he sends his servants ahead of him with gifts to give to Esau to potentially appease him or pacify him right there. So now with that, let's start at Genesis 32, verse 22. That night Jacob got up and took his two wives, his two female servants, and 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. Now, not the main point of this Devo, but men, don't take multiple wives, as every time polygamy is recorded in the Bible, it never ends well or goes well in general. That's especially with Jacob's two wives here, Rachel and Leah. These two sisters had some beef between each other, and it kind of makes sense, as usually two sisters marrying the same guy typically isn't a recipe for success, as just because something in the Bible is described doesn't mean it's prescribed. Now, with that point out of the way, after he sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So apparently, the possessions that he hadn't sent ahead to give to Esau as a gift are now making their way across the Jabbok. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Now let's camp out here for a minute. So this man is the angel of the Lord, or the pre-incarnate Christ. The fancy term theologians like to use are Christophany or theophany for an appearance of God in the Old Testament. So that's who's wrestling with God here, or Jacob is wrestling with God here. And notice how God initiates this struggle or encounter when Jacob is by himself and after having done everything he could to protect himself from Esau. Essentially, God is getting Jacob to the end of his vices here, or the end of his strength, as similar to how Peter had to be broken down before God would use him as an apostle. Jacob had to get to the end of his own strength for God to use him in a mighty way. As up to this point, Jacob had pretty much relied on his own wits, his own strength, as his name actually means deceiver, and he lived up to that name pretty well. As you guys recall, he tricked Esau into giving him his birthright, and also went along with his mother Rebekah's plan for his father Isaac to bless him instead of his older brother Esau. So up to this point, Jacob's kind of been rolling with his own wits here, and here he has this encounter with God, in which God is now wrestling with him to try to get him to the end of his own strength or vices. Now, when the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. So here we see the means of God inflicting weakness upon Jacob, of dislocating his hip, as this is very similar to Paul's thorn in the flesh in 2 Corinthians 12:7. As remember, God gave him this thorn in the flesh to prevent him from becoming proud or conceited. And Paul obviously didn't like it, as he prayed 3 times for God to remove it. However, God responds, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So here Jacob was being perfected by becoming weak for God to work through him. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So here we see the evidence of the transformation, as Jacob refuses to let go of God and is clinging to him with everything he has. This is quite similar to a parable Jesus tells us in Luke 11 in terms of prayer, as Jesus essentially instructs us to be constant in prayer by telling us a story of a hypothetical situation in which, say, you have a buddy that you go to borrow some bread from at midnight. You have some guests visiting, the local Panera is closed, and you need some carbs, so you go to your friend at midnight and say, "Hey, can I borrow some bread?" Of course, your friend's first instinct is going to be, wait, it's past midnight, the kids are already asleep, this isn't the time to process this sort of request. However, because of your audacity, your friend gets you the bread anyway. This is the mindset Jesus wants us to have in terms of prayer, in terms of never being afraid to go to Him, regardless of how late it is or how desperate the situation is. We can always have Jesus on speed dial. And in this case, regardless of how late it is, Jacob is refusing to let go of God and clinging into his strength, leaning into Him, rather than his own wit or his own craftiness, which he had pretty much been utilizing up to this point in his life. The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Now, of course, God knows Jacob's name, but for the sake of what he's about to teach Jacob, he pretends like he doesn't. It's very similar to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3 after they sin and in their own shame hide from God. God goes rolling through the garden, "Hey, where are you guys?" Obviously, God knows full well everything that happened, including where they're hiding. However, he just pretends like he doesn't just for the sake of what he's about to teach them there, which is not to hide from God or feel so ashamed as to go to him after we sin or mess up. Here, God is about to teach Jacob something very powerful. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." So remember, Jacob's name means deceiver, or the name Jacob means deceiver. However, the name Israel means God's prince or God's warrior. So here, as soon as Jacob gets to the end of himself and his own strength and is starting to cling to God with all he has, God gives him this very beautiful and powerful name in being God's prince or God's warrior, and really reaffirms or confirms that he's going to be the one through which the Israelite line will continue through the patriarchs because of now he's sort of at the end of his own strength. I mean, of course, he was called from birth to carry on the line. The younger will serve the older. But here, God confirms it in just a very beautiful and powerful way. And it's awesome how Jacob receives this blessing immediately, having come upon the end of his own strength. Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask me my name?" Then he blessed them there. So again, immediate blessing. Can't give a clear-cut answer as to why God doesn't tell Jacob his name. Perhaps it adds just the awe of the situation, or perhaps this is the way of God kind of challenging Jacob and saying, "Come on, man, you know my name, or you know who I am." Again, not the main point of the Devo. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It was because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." So again, seeing God face to face is no joke, or it's a pretty big deal. You guys recall in Isaiah chapter 6 when Isaiah is in the throne room of God and he immediately cries, "Woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips. My people are unclean too. It's not worthy to be in this situation here." There's also another story in Exodus 33 in which Moses is at the top of Mount Sinai with God, and he asks God to see his glory or see his face. And God essentially tells Moses, "Moses, no one can see my face and survive. So I'll tell you what, go stand in the cleft of that rock. My back will pass by and I'll cover up the rock with my hand. And as my back is moving by, I'll quickly remove my hand and you can kind of get a glimpse of my back, and that'll give you the appropriate foretaste of seeing my glory without you dying." So Jacob is very reverent of what just happened here. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. So what Jacob has lost in physical mobility or ability, he has gained in spiritual wisdom. As I'm reminded of the prophet Zechariah's words in Zechariah 4:6 regarding the reconstruction of the temple, "Not by might, not by strength, but by my Holy Spirit." And I think that's so big for us in our lives too, as you think, okay, rebuilding the temple, that's a physical project. And of course, it is going to require some strength there. But just knowing it all has to be in step with the Spirit and letting God lead us through and allowing His Spirit to mentor through us throughout the process is so big. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. So that's the close of Genesis 32. And there, it's obviously a very important day for the Israelites as well. So they commemorated it in their own way. But now, as we start to kind of land the plane here, just want to bring this back to really depending on God's strength and not our own, as Jesus himself says in John 15:5, that apart from him we can do nothing of eternal significance. And it's quite easy for us to set a goal, work super hard to achieve it, and then we're just so focused in the moment, we don't really pray about it, or kind of just like Jacob, use our own vices or own natural abilities just to accomplish it as kind of an ends in itself. But rather, whatever we do, say, look to achieve in this year, for may it be to glorify God, as may our weaknesses essentially be opportunities for us to humble ourselves and really see God's strength magnified through it. So, just a few thoughts that I had as I was reading this text, and hope God does a lot through Devoted this year. Been a pleasure sharing with you all, and be blessed.